Dr. Jayaratne, President of the Ceylon College of Physicians, the distinguished presidents of the London, Edinburgh and Australasian colleges, Professor Ranasinghe, the other distinguished physicians at the head table, distinguished members of the council, members of the college, our foreign visitors and resource people, ladies and gentlemen. Let me say that it's a great privilege to be invited to be here with you as you celebrate the Golden Jubilee of the Ceylon College of Physicians. This year clearly marks a major landmark in the history of the college, which has played such an important role in setting and maintaining standards not only for specialist physicians, but for the medical profession in general. The health of the population is a crucial determinant of a country's development prospects, and physicians provide the first line of preventive and curative treatment to maintain good health among the populace at large. As the apex institution, the Ceylon College of Physicians has over the years carried forward this responsibility with great distinction. And there have been many physicians who've been iconic figures, household names in this country. Now, as I said, it's a great pleasure to be here with you and an honor to be invited. But in my current position, whenever I get a captive audience like this, I'm afraid it's too much of a temptation to get a pitch in on what we're trying to do with the economy. So I hope you will bear with me for about 20 minutes while I try to give you a thumbnail sketch of what is being done to first stabilize and then put the economy on a sustained trajectory of growth and development. I'd like to first make the case that this is probably the best, the most propitious set of circumstances that Sri Lanka has faced for over 50 years. Now, why do I say that? If you look back to the 1950s, there were, over a period of about 25 years, a secular decline in the terms of trade of the country. As you will recall, the Sri Lankan economy was basically a tea, rubber and coconut economy. And for 25 years, the prices of those commodities fell. And in fact, if you look at the World Bank's World Development Report, its flagship publication, there's a box on Sri Lanka, the 1982 version, which cites Sri Lanka as a classic example of a country which had been buffeted by severe terms of trade. So you had this decline in the surpluses of the economy, and at the same time, in those years, in the 50s, 60s and 70s, you will recall that we had a demographic surge. So the population increased, the surpluses in the economy came down. And those were clearly two major drags on the development prospects of the country. And in order to really address these twin effects, the policymakers at that time followed what was being done in many parts of the developing world, and that is they tried to close the economy away from the world economy. The vagaries of the world economy were considered to be inimical to the interests of the country, and we tried to close our economy with various controls and quantitative restrictions. Clearly, for a small country with a population probably of about 15 million at that time, you couldn't sustain growth and development and create the number of jobs you needed through these inward-looking dirigist policies. So you had these twin effects of terms of trade decline, population surge, and policies which were inappropriate for a country like Sri Lanka, a relatively small country like Sri Lanka. But then we liberalized the economy in 1977-78, but shortly after that, of course, the 30-year conflict began. So yet another major drag on our development prospects. If you look around today, there are no such major drags on our economy, and we have the benefits of economic geography in the sense that we are in Asia, the most dynamic region in the world. We are 20 miles from the fastest growing large economy in the world, which is India, and we are smack in the middle of China's maritime Silk Route. So if you take all these things together, this is really a very favorable set of circumstances for the country. But however, to take advantage of these circumstances, in my view, we need to be aware of three important paradigm shifts that have taken place. And that will require us to effect a significant change in our mindsets. So what are these three changes in terms of paradigm? Now, if, as all of you know, probably better than certainly I do, Sri Lanka has been an overperformer, has punched way above its weight as far as social development is concerned. If you look at the UNDP Human Development Index, our ranking is much higher than you would expect it to be. In fact, if you look at Sri Lanka's ranking in the Human Development Index and Sri Lanka's ranking in terms of per capita income, the gap is the second largest in the world. So we have certainly outperformed as far as social development is concerned. If you look at the Millennium Development Goals, again, Sri Lanka has done extremely well. So do we need to change? Can we go on? Can we have business as usual? Can we have the kind of model of development with a fairly strong welfareist component? And I would submit to you that despite all our successes in terms of social development, the fact that we haven't placed sufficient emphasis on wealth creation and growth has given us perverse outcomes. What are these perverse outcomes that I'm talking about? We've had 2 youth insurrections in the south and a separatist conflict in the north where thousands of our young people have died. In my view, now there's complex causality behind these events, but in my view the main causal factor has been the mismatch between opportunities and expectations. So we haven't created enough high-value employment opportunities for our young people. So we haven't created enough wealth to sustain to the aspirations of our young people. So despite all our successes in terms of social development, clearly the picture is not complete. So we need to find a way of also having greater impetus in terms of growth and in terms of employment generation. That's one mindset. The interesting thing is, if you go to East Asia, people talk unashamedly about the need for growth. In South Asia, we never use the word growth without a prefix. We say sustainable growth, inclusive growth, participatory growth. We feel very shy about talking about growth. But because of these outcomes that I talked about, we need a balance. We need to have growth. And we need to have, certainly we need, and now I'm going to use the word inclusive growth for sure. We need good quality growth. And there are ways of achieving that. But we need to have a greater emphasis, greater focus on improving productivity and having greater growth. That's one mindset shift, one paradigm shift. The second paradigm shift is that Sri Lanka was the second country after Chile to liberalize its economy. And we became a country which had both a liberal economic policy framework as well as a liberal polity, a competitive democratic polity. So the traditional donors were extremely anxious to demonstrate good development outcomes in a country with democracy and liberal economic policies. So we became a donor darling and got large amounts of foreign aid. And this enabled us to live beyond our means. In fact, in every single year since 1987, the recurrent expenditure of the government has exceeded revenue. Now, it's okay to borrow for capital expenditure provided you screen your projects well and you get a rate of return. But to keep borrowing for recurrent expenditure, you think about your household. If day by day you're borrowing to meet your recurrent expenditure, clearly that's not sustainable. We were able to do it for many years because of this large infusion of foreign aid. But in 2010, we graduated from low-income country status, and gradually this access to concessional foreign aid is diminishing. We now have to go to international capital markets to borrow on commercial terms. We are at the mercy of rating agencies, because if our rating deteriorates, then that access becomes more difficult. The cost of borrowing becomes higher. Sometimes you can lose access altogether. So there is a far greater premium now attached to prudent economic management. We can't have our old ways of living beyond our means, because we'll get punished by the markets. And if we lose access to borrowing at the situation we're in now, it's the Greece type scenario. So there is now a very much higher premium attached to being very disciplined in the way we manage our economic affairs. The third paradigm shift is that we have had our demographic transition before we've had our economic transformation. By that I mean that our aging process has started at an earlier stage of our development process. Now, the implication of that is that you can no longer drive growth through what we call labor augmentation. When the population is growing, by increasing the number of people coming into the labor force, if you're able to provide jobs for them, then that drives the growth process. Once you get into an aging scenario and the number of people coming into the labor force begins to decline, then growth has to be driven to a much greater extent through productivity gains, which is much more difficult. Then you need innovation, you need R&D, you need to develop the kind of ecosystems which improves what economists call total factor productivity, which is a much tougher journey than just adding the labor force, adding onto the labor force and trying to get jobs for people. It's a much easier path than having to drive growth through productivity increases, which is what we now have to do. So these three paradigm shifts we need to internalize, and what it really says is that we have to be much more disciplined, much more focused on productivity, on good fiscal management, and good macroeconomic management in general. So those are the three paradigm shifts that we need to take into account and to respond to if we are to take advantage of these favorable circumstances that I spoke about. So what is the government doing to try to achieve the framework that's necessary to take advantage of the opportunity that lies out there? One is we are trying to have a much more systematic way of formulating macroeconomic policies. So the government has now set in place three frameworks for the three key macroeconomic policies. It has put in a framework of revenue enhancement-based fiscal consolidation to reduce the budget deficit to 3.5% of GDP. The second element of the macroeconomic policy-making framework is that the central bank is putting in place what the economists call a flexible inflation targeting regime. In lay terms, what that means is we are going to be much more forward-looking in terms of our monetary policy. We are trying to forecast what inflation is going to be in 6-12 months' time and to adjust interest rates in a proactive, forward-looking manner. If you do that, you have less volatility in your interest rate path. You don't have these peaks and troughs which we've had in the past, because we have tended to be much more reactive. We are now trying to become more proactive within this methodology, which is called flexible inflation targeting. The third thing is the exchange rate. Now, I'll come to the importance of exports. If we are to export, we have to have a competitive, not only exports, even for our import substitutes. If you have an overvalued exchange rate, basically you're subsidizing foreign producers at the expense of your local producers. Of course, it subsidizes consumers, which is why politicians find it difficult to have a realistic exchange rate, because there are many more consumers than there are producers. But in the long run, unless you produce, you get into trouble. So you've got to have a competitive exchange rate which gives producers of exports, producers of import competing goods, a fair chance. If your exchange rate is 10% overvalued, as it has been sometimes, basically you're asking your exporters and your producers of import substitutes to run 110 meters in a 100-meter rate, which is what we've been asking our exporters to do. And so, which is why our export performance has been so poor. One of the reasons, not the only reason. So those are the three kind of frameworks that are being put in place to formulate macroeconomic policies in a more systematic manner, and hopefully we can make that happen. In addition, the government is putting in place a growth model or a new approach to growth, as the Vision 2025 document that was launched a couple of days ago kind of terms it. And that growth model is going to be essentially private sector driven. I've been a public servant all my life, so I don't really believe that the private sector is a panacea for all ills. But we are in a situation where the government's debt dynamics are such that it simply doesn't have the resources to drive the development process. you have various mixes of the state and the private sector delivering good development outcomes. You have China and Vietnam at one end where the state plays a role. You have much more market-oriented economies also delivering good outcomes. However, in our case, the state simply does not have the resources. Our debt situation is such that the state can't drive the development process. So it's a pragmatic choice that we have to make, and to create the conditions for the private sector to drive growth, to create the jobs that we need. The other two pillars of the growth model are: one, exports. If you have a market of 21 million people with per capita income of about $3,800 US, you simply can't have 6-7% growth that you require to meet the aspirations of the people by selling mainly into the domestic market. One has to be competitive, and we have to have exports. Countries as large as China or as small as Singapore have driven their export transformation through export expansion. And also, whether you're China or Singapore or any size of country in between, that export transformation has been driven to a large extent by inflows of foreign direct investment, which brings in capital, which brings in technology, which brings in know-how, which brings in access to markets. So private sector driven, exports, FDI. Those are the kind of three key elements of the growth model. Now, some people say, is this the right time to go in for this model? Because the world economy has been experiencing subdued growth, and and international trade has been sluggish. So is this a time to depend on the external economy? And there I would say our locational advantage and our international relations trumps the subdued nature of the global economy, the headwinds in the global economy. What do I mean by that? As I said before, we are 20 miles from India, and it's growing fast. We are in the middle of China's maritime silk route, and the current geopolitical dynamics of the Indian Ocean are such. There are other countries like Japan and like some of the ASEAN countries who also have a great interest in having a role in Sri Lanka's development. So international relations, location in terms of the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean, if you bring that together, that trumps any headwinds there may be in terms of the global economy. And particularly in Asia, in East and Southeast Asia, good government-to-government relations often leads to inflows of investment as well. And so we can leverage our good bilateral international relations to get the foreign investment that we need. In fact, I've heard one commentator say that in terms of our external affairs, our theme should be strategic promiscuity, that we basically do business with everybody, whether it's the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians, the Europeans, the Americans. We need to be very clear what our national interest is. We pursue those national interests, but we should be willing to partner with anybody who is willing to come to help us to pursue our national interest. So that's the growth model. What is being done to make that growth model work? Well, the government has a program to improve the investment climate, to improve investment promotion, to improve trade facilitation, to improve trade policy. All this is there in this new Vision 2025 statement that was put out. So I won't bore you by going into detail, but there are lots of things which are planned, not yet executed, which are planned to drive the process forward. And I should say a word about trade policy because it's controversial, and rightly so. It's right for people to get nervous when Sri Lanka is negotiating with much larger countries. As you know, we have a bilateral agreement in goods with India that is now being extended to cover not only goods but services, investment, technology and training. A similar agreement is being negotiated with China and Singapore. Now, fortunately, there is a well-trodden path for small countries negotiating with larger countries. For instance, Mexico, which is not so small, but it is small in relation to the US and even in relation to the Canadian economy. But in NAFTA, Mexico was the big winner. And how do you do that? There are certain principles that govern negotiations between a small and a large country. One is non-reciprocity. That is, the large country does much more than the smaller country. That means we have a much longer negative list for our goods in terms of protecting our goods. And we have a much shorter positive list in terms of our services. Plus, you can have what they call safeguard arrangements, whereby if there is a surge in imports, you can automatically trigger some tariff. Say if the threshold can be 15%, 20%, you say, okay, if there's a sudden 20% increase in Indian motor vehicles, then you can have a tariff kick in. So these are the kinds of safeguards that one can put in. Also, even in terms of the positive lists, in terms of what a small country is going to do, it can be given a much longer phase-in period. So we can liberalize over 7, 9 years, whereas a large country does it over 2, 3 years. So there are various ways in which you can address the asymmetry in the size of economies. And our trade negotiators know this well. Clearly, we need to be very clear as to what our national priorities are. If you're able to negotiate well, this is potentially a big plus. And this is being done side by side with an anti-dumping law which is being put in, and a trade adjustment package to help local businesses which are being affected to improve their competitiveness, and local workers who are going to be affected to get some retraining, and also there's a national trade policy framework which kind of sets all this out. Now, why is this, in my view, so important? Because if we are able to successfully conclude these negotiations, we will have preferential access to China, preferential access to India. We also have preferential access to Pakistan with the bilateral FTA. We have GSP plus with Europe, and then we'll have also access to Singapore. You take all that together, that means preferential access to a market of over 3 billion people. There is no other country in the world which has preferential access to China, India, and Europe. Now, there are 190 odd countries chasing foreign direct investment. So you need some kind of differentiator. The fact that you have preferential access to a market of 3 billion people, that is a differentiator. You can show investors this market. Come and locate in Sri Lanka, sell into India. Come and locate on a preferential basis. Locate in Sri Lanka, sell to China on a preferential basis, or Europe. So this is really no other country. Singapore has preferential access to both China and India, but no country has access to the three, to China, India, and Europe. So if we are able to do this, I think that the trick then is to leverage what the economists call the trade investment nexus. Show the preferential access to the market to attract investment in here. With that, let me just give you just a bit of a flavor of some of the major development programs that the government has in mind. Let me start with Kandy, because there are development corridors along these new highways that are being built. Well, the southern highway is already there, and then you have the central highway and another one to Kegol, and the roads in the north connecting Trincomalee to Dambulla, etc., are also going to be improved. So it's going to be improved connectivity, and along these arteries, there are major development programs. So let me start with Kandy. Japan is putting in place a master plan for the development of Kandy, which they're willing to support. So there's a strong kind of religio-cultural tourism component in that, as well as an industrial zone. Then you come down the central highway, you come to Kurunagala, Kuliyapitiya. There are some industrial zones planned there. The Andhra Pradesh Development Corporation and Korea have shown some interest there. Then you keep coming down, and in the western province, you have the Western Region Megapolis. Then you have the Port City project. Then you keep going down the southern highway. There are some developments. The Thais are coming in with an industrial zone in Kalutara. I think it's called Meli in Kalutara. Then you go further south. There are some smaller industrial zones and tourism developments. And then you get to Hambantota, and you have the port and the development around it. Now, I'd like to say a few words about the Hambantota port, long lease to China Merchant. I've always felt that the discussion on the lease of the Hambantota port was not framed as well as it could have been, in my opinion. Why I say that is that while it was essential that we got the best possible deal and our national interests and our security interests were protected in the deal, it is not really just a port deal, because that port deal triggers a lot more. In the first instance, the Chinese are planning to build a cement factory, an LNG plant, a refinery, a steel billet plant, and a ship repair facility. These are what they call foundational industries to develop the industrial zones that they plan to develop in that area. So, almost 70 years, 69 years after independence, we have done remarkably little for the people of Monragala, remarkably little for the people of Uva. The people of Hambantota have assets that don't work for them. And this thing can transform all that. The Chinese, the long lease of a Hambantota port will trigger $5-6 billion worth of investment over a period of time, of course. But as I said, in the first instance, these 4 foundational industries. So that is potentially transformative of an area which, after all, were heartlands of the JVP movements in 71 and 88, 89. And because we didn't do anything for those people. And this is an opportunity to do that. Then you go further up to Trincomalee, and the Singaporeans are doing a master plan. The same company that did the Western Region Megapolis plan is doing a master plan for Trincomalee. And the idea there is for Japan, India, and Singapore to work together to develop that area. And hopefully, that development will not only benefit the eastern province, but also the people of Rajarata, that it will create opportunities through industrial zones in that area. So, and then there's a lot of infrastructure development. There's infrastructure development for the north. The Kankathantote and Palali ports are being developed. So if you bring all this together, potentially, in 5-7 years' time, there could be a transformative change in this country. The plans are good. If you have the time to read the economic vision, it's an impressive document. But when people ask me what are the 3 priorities that we have before us, and I say implementation, implementation, and implementation. The jury is still out whether we can execute. That's really the challenge. We know what to do, we need to get it done. We've known what to do for some time, to be fair, but we had difficulty in getting it done for various reasons. But this time around, there's a tremendous opportunity. I should say one other thing. The potential binding constraint is human resource development. We need to get our education, training, and skills development well aligned to support these development programs that the government has. That's a big ask, because that, as you know, while we've done very well in terms of enrollment ratios in formal education, our learning outcomes, particularly in the STEM subjects, have not been as robust as they should be. So that is another challenge, and the government is addressing that. They have a major program in terms of the education, training, and skills development sector, but again, we need to get it done. So what I would say is that the plans are all in place. We need to get it done. And here I would appeal to you, because all the people in this room are very important opinion makers in this country. And I think for too long we've sat back and waited for the government to do everything. I'm not sure that's a good option. I think all of us really need to think, is there a real opportunity this time around? Is the direction of travel positive? Is the macroeconomic policy stabilizing the economy? Is there a good program in terms of growth and development? Are the building blocks being put into place in terms of various projects and programs? If that is so, I think we need to develop a consensus in terms of what is possible in this country, and all of us need to really put our shoulder to the wheel. Thank you all very much. Thank you.